So what are we going to talk about today? I'll give you a little bit of an overview. We're going to talk about why we have to use Robert's Rules of Order in Vermont school boards, some basic principles of Robert's Rules, roles and responsibilities of the chair under the rules, and also of board members. And then we'll get into a little bit about the types of motions and some useful resources that you can refer to when you have questions about a matter of process under Robert's Rules. So moving on, Vermont law requires use of Robert's Rules. Section 554 of Title 16 states that Robert's Rules of Order shall govern the conduct of school board meetings. And when the legislature uses the word shall, it means that that action is required. So school boards are required to use Robert's Rules of Order, and smaller boards may vote to use Robert's Rules for small boards, which have some modifications that permit some greater flexibility and informality. In our previous webinar, there were some questions about Robert's Rules for small boards, so I'm just going to go over the basics of Robert's Rules for small boards very quickly right now. We may decide to offer an additional webinar on this, and something I've actually been thinking about is maybe doing some mini webinars just on specific parts of Robert's Rules, because this is all, there's a pretty thick book about it. It's a lot to cover in 1 hour. And so today you'll get an overview, and as I said, maybe in the future we can delve into more detail in some shorter videos on specific issues. So Robert's Rules for small boards. Here is the rundown on that. First, members may raise their hand instead of standing when seeking to obtain the floor, and they can remain seated while they're making a motion or when they're debating. Secondly, motions do not need to be seconded under Robert's Rules for small boards. Third, there's no limit to the number of times a member can speak to a debatable question. Under the regular rules, there is a limit. Fourth, informal discussion of a subject is permitted while no motion is pending. And fifth, when a proposal is clear to all present, a vote can be taken without a motion having been introduced. Sixth, the chair need not rise when putting questions to vote. And then 7, the chair may speak in informal discussions and debate without leaving the chair, which is different also from regular Robert's Rules. And then finally, the chair may vote on all questions. So Robert's Rules for small boards is quite different. As you can see, it's much less formal. And as I indicated, we may go into more detail on Robert's Rules for small boards in a future webinar. Moving on, I wanted to let you know about the most current version of Robert's Rules, because that is the one that you should be using. And it is the 12th edition that came out in 2020. The reason you should be using it is because it supersedes all previous editions. And it has some really useful organization to it that is new. It has section and paragraph numbering. So it's very easy to pinpoint which part of the rules you're talking about when referring to them. And as you can see on this slide, the 12 boldface number refers to an entire section. Here it would be section 12. And the 2 numbers separated by a colon refer to a paragraph. So the first number here would be section 12, paragraph 1. All of the information that I'm providing today is from the 12th edition of Robert's Rules. Basic principles of Robert's Rules is what we're going to be talking about next. And the author of the rules, I have a quote from him because I think it really helps shed some light on the basic principles of the rules. And that quote is, "The great lesson for democracies to learn is for the majority to give the minority a full, free opportunity to present their side of the case. And then for the minority, having failed to win a majority of their views, gracefully to submit and to recognize the action as that of the entire organization, and cheerfully to assist in carrying it out until they can secure its repeal." So as this slide indicates, the principles of the Robert's Rules of Order are to protect several different entities. It protects the majority to decide. It also provides protection for the minority to be heard. And individual members have protection under the rules, as well as absentee members, because there's a requirement for accurate minutes to be taken. So the rules really protect all of these different groups together. Moving on to the purpose of Robert's Rules. Really, the purpose of the rules is to be able to have your meetings run smoothly. And meetings run smoothly when the board is able to get its business done. They promote cooperation. One thing that is very much emphasized in Robert's Rules is that only one question can be considered at a time. They provide for free and full debate, protect the rights of absentees, and record action which is taken and make it a matter of record. So it's a method of organizing and conducting meetings, and it's really a time-tested method. The chair's role and responsibilities. This is covered by Section 3 of Robert's Rules. And I'm going to talk to you about a couple of different paragraphs in that section. Paragraph 9 talks about the customs of formality that are followed by the chair and also by the members. And they serve to maintain the chair's necessary position of impartiality. Paragraph 11, the presiding officer is not addressed or referred to by name. Members address only the chair or address each other through the chair. And the presiding officer speaks of themselves only in the third person, does not use the pronoun I, and does not address an individual as you. Got a second slide on the chair's roles and responsibilities because there are so many of them. When the meeting time has arrived, the chair determines that a quorum is present, and then they call the meeting to order by stating the meeting will come to order. The chair then calls for the agenda items in the order they appear on the agenda. Before a member can make a motion or speak in debate, they must obtain the floor, and that involves being recognized by the chair as having the exclusive right to be heard at that time. After a motion is made, there are specific steps the chair takes to handle the motion. The presiding officer, the chair, also protects the board from what are called dilatory motions, those that are frivolous, absurd, or irrational. And it's the duty of the chair to prevent members from misusing motions for dilatory purposes, but they should never permit personal feelings to affect their judgment. If a chair only suspects that a motion is not made in good faith, they should give the maker of the motion the benefit of the doubt. Last slide about the chair talks about how they protect their impartial position. So they protect their impartial position by voting only when the vote would affect the outcome, in which case they can either vote or they can, and that way they would change the result, or they can abstain. As presiding officer, the chair does not enter discussion of the merits of pending questions unless they leave the chair until the pending business is finished. And there's a specific information about that in section 43 of the rules. So on rare occasions, the presiding officer may decide to participate in debate. They must turn the chair over to another member and cannot return to the chair until the pending question has been disposed of. Before we move on to board members and their decorum in debate, are there any questions about anything that I've covered so far?
Sue, we don't have any in the Q&A box yet.
Okay, I will move on then. So, board members' decorum in debate. You can see that it's set out on this slide, what is expected of board members. And they need to confine their remarks to the merits of the pending question, refrain from attacking another member's motives. All remarks should be addressed through the chair. So they're going to avoid using other board members' names. And refrain from speaking adversely on a prior action not pending, refrain from speaking against their own motion, and refrain from disturbing the assembly. This is an example of that would be having side conversations. Another thing to note under board members' decorum in debate is that each member has a right to speak on the same question on the same day twice. And they can't speak a second time if there's someone who hasn't spoken yet who would like the floor. So the chair manages all of that to make sure that everyone is heard. So let's talk about obtaining the floor. Before a member can make a motion or speak in debate, they have to obtain the floor, and that involves being recognized by the chair as having the exclusive right to be heard. So to claim the floor, a member would raise their hand and wait to be recognized by the chair. If they're entitled to the floor, the chair is going to recognize them. And when someone has the floor, other members may not interrupt except for a very few specific purposes, and only then if it is sufficiently urgent to be justified. And that is covered in the rules in section 3 and section 42. Let's talk a little bit about when a meeting is out of order. What are the characteristics of a meeting that would be deemed to be out of order? If individual members are making personal remarks, if they're bringing up the same motion or essentially one like it, putting a debatable issue to vote before the full debate is complete. Debates are not directed at motions, but motives, principles, and personalities. You might see members yelling out in opposition or members speaking without being recognized by the chair. So those are some indications that the rules are not being followed and that your meeting is out of order. And there's actually a whole section in the book, section 61, that covers breaches of order and how they can be addressed. And there's a lot of information in that section. It's definitely a good section for a chair to have at their fingertips. And it even includes some language in that section about that the chair can use. And it sort of has a graduated approach where the first thing that the chair would say is the member is out of order and will be seated. And then it has, suggestions for what the chair can do if that is not effective. And if a board member feels that another member is out of order and the chair is not stepping up and taking care of it, that person can say, Chair, I call the member to order. And at that point, then the chair would need to determine whether they think the person is out of order and take the necessary steps. So let's assume your meeting is in order, and we'll talk about the steps to making a motion. A motion, as I'm sure all of you know, is a proposal by a member in a meeting that the board takes certain action. And this slide shows the steps that are used in making a motion. Some examples of a motion that you might see in a school board meeting are, I move to adopt the equity policy as recommended by the policy committee, or I move to approve the proposed budget for the next school year. As indicated on the slide, the chair would then recognize the person who wants to make a motion. The person states their motion, and then another member seconds the motion. So, steps to handling a motion. The first thing that the chair does is state the motion and place it before the board. So there's some suggested language on this slide, steps to handling a motion. The chair would say it is moved and seconded that, fill in the blank. Is there any discussion? And at that point, members are recognized and they debate the motion. And this is the time when subsidiary motions may be introduced. And we're going to talk next about, after we get through how to handle a motion, we'll talk about the types of motions. And subsidiary motions are one of the main types of motions. So moving on to steps 3 and 4 of handling a motion. After the discussion or debate is complete, the chair puts the question to a vote. The question is on the adoption of the motion too. Those in favor, please say aye. Those opposed, please say nay. And then the chair announces the results of the vote. So if the vote passes, the chair may say those in favor have it. The motion has been adopted to, or if it doesn't pass, those opposed have it. The motion to does not pass. And then moving on, the next order of business is. So now we're going to talk about the types of motions. Before I do that though, Phil, are there any questions on how to handle a motion?
No, we don't have any questions that have come in the chat.
Okay. Well, the people on this webinar will be receiving a list of many questions that we received the last time we provided this webinar. So I think they'll find that helpful, even if they don't have specific questions today. So let's talk about the types of motions. Section 5 of Robert's Rules describes the types of motions in detail, as well as their order of precedence. And the 3 types of motions are main motions, secondary motions, and motions that bring a question before the board again. Secondary motions are further divided into 3 different subcategories, which are subsidiary motions, privileged motions, and incidental motions. And I'll get into a little bit of information about each of these in the upcoming slides. Section 6 of Robert's Rules of Order notes the following about main motions. Only a motion whose introduction, this is the only motion whose introduction brings business before the assembly. So the examples I gave you before about adopting a policy or approving the proposed budget, those are things that would be considered to be main motions. And they really set the pattern from which all of the other motions are derived. You can only make a main motion when no other motion is pending. And even though they're called the main motion, they rank lowest in the order of precedence of motions. And we'll move on to secondary motions. Section 5 explains secondary motions. Secondary motions can be considered while the main motion is pending without violating the principle of taking up only one question at a time. Secondary motions must be acted upon or disposed of before direct consideration of the main motion can be continued. Secondary motions take precedence over the main motion, and certain secondary motions take precedence over others. And this is related to the division of secondary motions into classes of subsidiary, privileged, and incidental motions. There's a chart at the back of the Robert's Rules 12th edition that illustrates when each subsidiary or privileged motion is in order. The main motion, The 7 subsidiary motions and the 5 privilege motions fall into a definite order of preference, which gives a particular rank to each of these 13 motions. The main motion, which does not take precedence over anything, ranks lowest. Each of the other 12 motions has its proper position in the order, taking precedence over the motions that rank below it and yielding to those that rank above it. And then the privilege motions rank above all other motions. So let's talk about a specific type of secondary motion, which is the subsidiary motions. So I noted in the previous slide, we have 3 types of motions. We've got main motions, secondary motions, and motions that bring a question before the board again. I just covered main motions, and they're, I think, fairly straightforward. You're probably pretty familiar with them. There are 3 types of secondary motions: subsidiary, privileged, and incidental, and we're now covering subsidiary motions. Section 6, paragraph 6 sets forth the 5 characteristics of subsidiary motions. So they have to have all 5 of the following characteristics. They're always applied to another motion while it's pending. They can be applied to any main motion. They fit into an order of precedence so that no subsidiary motion can be moved when a subsidiary motion of a higher rank is pending. They're out of order when another member has the floor, and they are in order during the entire time that a motion to which they can be applied is pending. So you're probably wondering, what are these subsidiary motions? I've got them listed here on the slide, the 7 subsidiary motions. The first is the motion to postpone the main question indefinitely. This one disposes of a question without bringing it back to a direct vote. Next, we have the motion to amend, and that is a proposal to change the wording of the main motion before the main motion is voted on. Next, motion to commit the main question. This turns the motion over to a committee for study or redrafting. Next, we have a motion to postpone to a certain time. And this allows the board to consider the main motion later at the same meeting or at another meeting. Motion to limit or extend the limits of debate. A member can move to place a limit on the debate if the debate is taking too much time, or a member can move to extend debate if circumstances make that advisable. Next, we have motion to move the previous question. This closes debate and so that it will come to an immediate vote. Motion to lay on the table. This lays a main motion aside temporarily without setting a time for resuming its consideration. It can be taken up again when the majority decides to do so. And we'll talk about later about how you do that. Let's take a break now to see if there are any questions on these 7 subsidiary motions.
Sue, I'm not sure if this is the place, it's not specifically here on subsidiary motions, but what if the board makes a decision in one meeting? How soon can that be retaken up? Like, can there be a motion to reconsider that in the same meeting, or is that have to happen at a different meeting? How does that work?
So I'm going to get to that in a couple of slides. I will cover that question because that's a pretty common question.
Okay. There aren't any more written.
Okay, great. I'll move on so we can get to that question. So next we'll talk about the privileged motions, and these relate to pending business. They are special matters of immediate and overriding importance, which without debate should be allowed to interrupt consideration of anything else. And all privileged motions take precedence over motions of any other class. I'll move on to let you know what those 5 privileged motions are. They are call for the orders of the day, If the agenda schedule is not being followed, a single member can call for the schedule to be enforced unless the assembly decides by 2/3 vote to set the orders of the day aside. So that's call for the orders of the day. Raise a question of privilege. This is used if a pressing situation is affecting the rights of the board or an individual member. For example, noise or introduction of a confidential subject in the presence of guests. And this motion, if a member raises a question of privilege, it permits them to interrupt pending business to state an urgent request. Move to recess proposes a short intermission in a meeting for a specified length of time. Move to adjourn proposes to close the meeting entirely. And lastly, move to fix the time to which to adjourn. While business is pending, the board may wish to set the date, time, and place for another meeting before its next regular meeting. All right, we will move on to incidental motions. These are the third type of secondary motion. Section 6, paragraph 15 covers the characteristics of incidental motions. And they deal with questions of procedure arising out of another motion or an item of business. They're usually related to the main question in such a way that they have to be decided immediately before business can proceed. And most incidental motions are undebatable. Now, there are 11 incidental motions. I have a slide entitled the 11 incidental motions, but I'm not going to go into all 11 of them in this webinar because we don't necessarily have time for that. But I wanted to cover two that I think maybe used a little bit more often than some of the others. The first one is point of order. If a member feels that the chair is failing to follow the rules, or that the meeting itself is failing to follow the rules, the member can call attention to it by making a point of order. And it's very important to note that this needs to be done at the time that the breach occurs. It can't be done, 15 minutes later. Another type of incidental motion is an appeal. Any two members, by moving and seconding an appeal immediately after the chair has made a ruling on a question of parliamentary procedure, can require the chair to submit the matter to a vote of the entire board. Moving on to precedence of incidental motions. Wanted to make sure to note that an incidental motion is only in order when it's legitimately incidental to another pending motion. So you wouldn't be able to make a point of order if there's not another pending motion being considered, or when it's legitimately incidental in some other way to business at hand. An incidental motion that is in order takes precedence over any other motions that are pending. So now we're going to get to the motions that bring a question before the board again. And this is where I'll respond to the question that you asked a few minutes ago, Phil. And these motions are related to some pretty important principles of parliamentary law. And those are that the same or substantially same question cannot be brought up again except through special procedures. And this is where these motions come into play. While a question is temporarily disposed of but is not finally settled, no similar or conflicting motion whose adoption would restrict the board in acting on the first question can be introduced. And then finally, to change what the board has adopted requires something more in the way of a vote or previous notice to members than was necessary to adopt it in the first place. So there are 4 motions that you can use to bring a question again. And I'm going to cover those in some details here. As you can see, they are the motion to take from the table, the motion to rescind, motion to discharge a committee, and motion to reconsider. And the numbers that you can see on the slide after each one of those motions are the section in Robert's rules where they are covered. And as you can see, each one of them has its own section. So there's quite a bit of information in the rules about these types of motions. And I would encourage you, if you're dealing with a situation where you think you might need to use this kind of a motion, to really take a look at the specific chapter that covers the motion that you're thinking about using. Starting off with the motion to take from the table, it's covered by section 34 and resumes consideration of a main motion which lies on the table. So we talked earlier about the motion to lay on the table. This is the motion to take from the table. It's how you get the motion off of the table. The next is the motion to rescind. It's covered by section 35. And it's used to cancel an entire main motion that has been adopted and that has continuing force and effect. The motion to discharge a committee is covered by section 36. Motion to discharge a committee is used if a question has been referred or a task has been assigned to a committee that has not made its final report and the board wants to take the matter out of the committee's hands. And that could be either because the board itself wants to consider the question or so that the question is not further considered. Next, the motion to reconsider is covered by section 37, and it applies if in the same session that a motion was voted on or the next day on which a meeting is held, so it would be in the same meeting or the next meeting, new information or a changed situation makes it appear that a different result might reflect the true will of the board. In that case, a member who voted with the prevailing side can, by moving to reconsider the vote, propose that the question come before the board again as if it had not previously been voted on. So motion to reconsider has some rules associated with it as far as time constraints and who can bring the motion. That differentiates it from the motion to rescind. Next slide, I'm going to cover motion to rescind in more detail. So the motion to rescind can only be moved when no other motion is pending. And an important thing to know about the motion to rescind is that you can give previous notice of intent to offer this motion at the next meeting. And it can be applied to any decision which has continuing force and effect made at any time as a result of the adoption of a main motion. So it doesn't have those same time constraints as the motion to reconsider. And this is really important. It requires a majority vote when notice of intent to make the motion was given at the previous meeting or in the agenda. Otherwise, it requires a 2/3 vote. So if you plan on making a motion to rescind, giving notice of intent to make the motion will influence the number of votes that are needed to pass that vote. I'm going to pause there just for a moment, Phil, in case there's any follow-up questions on those motions that I just covered that the previous question asked about.
And I'm not seeing any yet, Sue.
Okay. So I'd like to now talk about some resources that I have found really helpful in Robert's Rules of Order. And these are right in the book. There is a table at the back of the book, and it has all of this information in it. It has type of motion. Is it in order when another person has the floor? Must it be seconded? Is it debatable? Is it amendable? How many votes are required for adoption? Is it majority vote or 2/3 vote? And can it be reconsidered? So that's a really useful table that's at the very back of the book. And then also at the back of the book, and I think this may be new in this edition, or else I never saw it in a previous edition. There are sample forms used in making motions. So if you are thinking about making a motion and you are looking for some guidance as to how to word that motion, take a look at the sample forms that are in the back of the book. I wanted to note one piece of open meeting law that needs to be complied with over and above Robert's Rules of Order. And that is that any addition to or deletion from the agenda has to be made as the first act of business at the meeting. And you can find that in the open meeting law at 1 VSA section 312. Additionally, any other adjustments may be made at any time during the meeting, according to the open meeting law. And lastly, I wanted to just have one slide that covered public comment, because we tend to get quite a few questions about this. Just as Robert's rules assist the chair in running the meeting, there are provisions in Vermont law that help the chair handle the public comment period. The word reasonable appears in both statutes on this slide. You've got 16 VSA section 554B that says that there has to be a reasonable opportunity to appear and express views on any matter discussed by the board, considered by the board, that has to be given to any person in the school district. And then the open meeting law says that public comment shall be subject to reasonable rules established by the chair. When planning for public comment, think about what would be considered reasonable by the average person, and then apply that as evenly and consistently as possible. So I've reached the end of our presentation. I hope that we've given you some good tools to think about as far as making sure that your meetings are well run and that the business of the board gets accomplished. And we're always happy to answer any questions that you have. So if you think of any questions after this webinar, please feel free to send an email. As we indicated, we'll be following up with a list of frequently asked questions along with the answers to those questions. And hope you all have well-run, efficient, and productive meetings. Thank you very much.